Hello, everybody. Welcome. This session is called State of the Art, Creative Technology and the Museum. We're going to talk about creativity today. All right. Yeah. That's what I'm talking about. My name is Chad Weinard. Where's that next slide? Who are you? My name is Chad Weinard. I'm a museum technologist. Some of the projects we're going to be talking about were completed while I was at the Balboa Park Online Collaborative. I was director of digital media out in beautiful sunny San Diego. And my partner in crime today is Jason Alderman.
That's me. So now I guess I don't have to say my name. I used to work with Chad. I still work at Balboa Park Online Collaborative as a consultant. So most of our developers and designers and creative technologist folks are in a consulting capacity. But anyway, we were also supposed to have a third person up here, as you may have noticed, Brinker Ferguson, and she is unfortunately Indiana Jonesing right now. She is on a plane somewhere over to Riyadh to do some cultural heritage preservation work. So best wishes to her. So please bear with us. We're going to kind of wing it through her part of the presentation, and I'll try to do my best Brinker Ferguson imitation. Actually, I won't. I'm not going to do that. Yeah.
You'll have to know that we were a team. We still are in making projects, and she was our project manager. If you've ever had a great project manager, she keeps things together. So we'll do our best.
Yes.
Without
yes.
her.
We tend to get a little bit wildly excited about everything, as you might be able to tell. And so if we start to spiral out of control, well, we're getting to that in a slide. So anyway, this is going to be a little bit creative. So what is creativity? When we look up creativity online, you find the word creative in the definition a lot. This is my favorite dictionary. Yes, I have a favorite dictionary. It's Wordnik. And it's like searching Google for recursion. And did you mean recursion? And it's kind of a rabbit hole that you just keep on drilling down into. So let's get into defining creativity for our purposes here in this talk.
Creativity is a mindset of doing something new, especially within constraints. In museums, we know a lot about constraints. Our structure for today, we are imagining a pinballing discussion. Are you going to make the ding 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 song?
Ding 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 ding.
All right, very good.
Ding.
First section, we're going to talk about museums a little bit. What does creativity mean within an institutional context? Then we're going to talk about museum technologists in particular. And then we'll talk about creativity for visitors in our digital projects.
Okay, so charging ahead into museums.
First up for museums, the vision. Museums as creative spaces for technologists, for staff, and for visitors. This is kind of the Pegasus in the sky vision for museums.
Take me to the land of ebooks.
And the reality, in many cases, is inertia. Museums are really good at saying, this is how we've always done it. And that's not a great platform for creativity. Organizations today, though, especially as we talk big picture with them and we talk strategy with them, are realizing that creativity is required. Visitors are looking for creative experiences. Staff is expecting a creative workplace. And to achieve their missions, museums are slowly finding out that creativity is necessary. So getting creative, what does that mean for a museum? Getting creative for a museum means allowing in-house staff to be creative, or it means going to outside contractors, agencies, to get creative projects done, or it means commissioning art that might be creative. And there is sometimes a blur between these as well. Sometimes the in-house staff will be the ones that are managing the outside agencies. Sometimes the in-house staff are making digital works that are as creative as a commissioned artist might make. We have run into situations, certainly in Balboa Park, where we're working with 27 different museums and cultural institutions of all stripes, science museums and model railroad museums, art museums, photography museums. Each one handles creativity in a different way. The art museum is the least likely, perhaps, to take on a museum technologist project as a work of art, whereas the science museum will give license for creativity in a way that the photography museum might not. Museums need to invest in infrastructures for creativity. So today's creativity may require yesterday's drudgery. The infrastructure has to be there. We talk a good bit about baseline builds, so not reinventing the wheel every time you build a project. Having some sort of baseline that's reusable and ideally shareable to start your project with. We talk about flexibility, so APIs for museums and plumbing. To have that work done means that creative projects are easier, quicker, faster. Getting creative for museums also means capacity building. Doing a creative project as a museum technologist so often happens in your spare time. You need to find time to be creative. Finding time to be creative means making space for creative teams. It means giving permission for creativity. It means encouraging and giving a roadmap for sidetrack projects, which we talk about a good bit. And it also means stop. It means stop doing some things. To prioritize creative projects, you need to deprioritize some projects to make up space and make room and build capacity for creativity. Let's talk about a project. That was a fun one. This is a project that brings up a lot of these issues of museums, but also the museum technologist and community issues as well. Self-reflection was a project that we did based on an exhibition called 7 Billion Others. This was an exhibition at the Museum of Photographic Arts in Balboa Park. The essence of the exhibition was to connect stories and common humanity across cultures. One of the curatorial efforts was to allow visitors to see yourself in others and to see others in yourself. So you are made up and part of a worldwide community. This resonated with me, even as I was in early meetings with some of the folks at MOPA. Sometimes your mind makes connections, and I remember being in a meeting and saying, I saw this thing on the web, on the blog, and it was from the Met. It was a project called Metmere, and it was on a blog post, and I had seen it months before. And I thought to myself, there might be a connection here that is worth making. Full credit to the Met. That project was on open source and available. And we were able to, at that point, say, MOPA, I think we have an idea that might work. And we were at a stage where they weren't even sure exactly what they wanted or where it was going to go. And they were at a stage where they could say, we have this concept for an exhibition. What kind of ideas can we generate? And we were able to step in.
So now I'm going to try to show a video. We'll find out if it works. We're not getting any audio, but it's okay because there isn't really a whole lot of audio. But as you can see, we took the faces from the 7 Billion Others exhibit. We had, I think it was 896 different face images, and we mapped them to different colors using the source code from the Met's Media Lab. Yeah, and we got some cute moments too.
Yes. There were some fun moments. The essence of that though was to have seen that post and maybe not even have reacted to it at the moment, but to have been able to recall it months later and make a connection. And source code was there to easily build on something that was already there, connect it, and expand on it. Taking the source content from the exhibition, the 900 Faces, and pin it to an idea, which is seeing yourself in others and others' faces making up yourself.
So the first thing that we did is we took the source code off of GitHub, and to understand it, we kind of went through and commented it a ton, because it was actually based on. No. No, we've all been there, and we've all been trying to launch something, and it's just, let's get this out the door. So that's just kind of my way of understanding. So that's my little pro tip, I guess, for this session is when you're trying to understand something, just writing comments everywhere really helps. It doesn't make it more readable. It actually makes it less readable, but it does help a lot. So we went through to try to figure out what it was doing and how it was doing. And there were also some variable names that were based on, I guess, the previous version, which was based on Street Fighter faces. Apparently it was a mirror made of faces from the game Street Fighter. So that's why the things were named faces, and at first I was thinking, wait a minute, this is about museum objects, and they named these variables faces. Did they know that we were going to make a MOPA mirror out of it? So the Met, you are prescient. But anyway, as we went through it, one of the things we had to do was adapt it so that it fit the aspect ratio, because it was originally for square pixels, and so we had to make it fit these portraits that were kind of in a 2:3 ratio. And if you can squint, you can kind of make out the really rough, dumb math that I'm doing at the top, saying, okay, these are the number of images that we can fit that will look good, and it will actually have the right number of portraits on an HD monitor that's arranged in this way. And that's actually wrong, because we ended up turning the HD television the other way around, and so we had to do all this math over, and I didn't update those comments. And then over on the right, you can see there's another document. In the process of this, the Met Mirror code works from one giant sprite image. It's one image that has all of the tiny little images that are being used to make up your image that are inside it. And so we needed to turn these 896 images into one giant sprite that we could draw from in this. And that is kind of tough to do manually, and also a real pain in the neck. And since computers automate the stuff that we find really difficult, we wrote a program to do it and wrote it in processing. And so we have a sprite generator thing. And that also let us, when we figured out that we had oriented them the wrong way, it was just a few lines of code to rotate them 90 degrees to get them configured correctly. We also did some math, because when we originally had it, the lightest and darkest pixels, skin tones actually don't have the greatest range of colors, surprise, surprise. And so when you're trying to map them to RGB colors, the lightest and darkest values, usually it hits a certain threshold, and then you have one person's face on all the white parts and another person's face on all the dark parts. And you'll see that a little bit later in something that we demo. But we needed to change that. So we added some randomness that it picked from the bottom three and the top three, and we made a spreadsheet that actually analyzed the lightness values of all the pictures. So that was, these are things that you don't really think about until you're kind of in the middle of it. Another thing was that it ran dog slow on my machine. I had an aluminum MacBook, not Pro, from 2008, and I was just thinking, this is never going to run well in the gallery. And then we tried it on Chad's computer, and it worked beautifully. And then we put it on a NUC, one of those tiny little Intel computers, worked beautifully. So test on multiple machines. And then we also, one thing that we did do well on this is that we built in something where it would listen to the keyboard, and if you pressed a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it would change the size, so that you could change the size of the faces that we could test in gallery when we were in front of the stakeholders and say, okay, we're adjusting it, what size looks well. And when you made the faces smaller, obviously there were more computations, and so it ran slower. So it kind of became this feel, and you let the science become art at that point. And we pitched doing automatic scale adjustment, and we looked at doing a bunch of things with everything from knobs and switches to maybe having some kind of depth sensing. And then we thought, oh, wait, we could use computer vision, because Chad loves computer vision.
Yes.
He really loves computer vision. We could use computer vision to detect the size of somebody's face. So I took a half an hour, and thankfully, Greg Bornstein has some amazing libraries on OpenCV for processing that you can get up and started in about 30 minutes. And so sure enough, this is me in my apartment with a tape measure trying to map how close I can get to it and what the values are. If you see there's a little green number over in the corner, that's the size, the area of the square that it's drawing around the face that it's detecting.
Hey, Jason, can I interrupt just a minute?
Yes.
You said something important when you said half an hour.
Yeah.
To bring it back to creativity, time boxing. For all these things, you might have an idea, and it might be a crazy idea, but it might be a really cool idea. If you give yourself a constraint, a time box, if you say, okay, I don't know if this is going to go anywhere, but let's spend an hour on it. Let's spend a half an hour on it. Let's see where it goes.
And this was one of my first projects with Balboa Park, and Chad said, okay, you've got an hour. What can you do? I was like, I have no idea how I'm going to get this done, but just dive into it and poke at it and see what you can make happen. So after we tested this, and I'm not going to subject you to that video, after we tested that, we put it in the gallery, and then we were still tweaking some of the details. You can see over in the far little corner there, there's the little NUC computer that was running it. That was put up behind there. They actually, in the gallery, decided to situate the webcam over on the side, which made it kind of interesting in the way that people walked up to it. You could actually see the full person within the portrait. If they had put it up there, it was kind of a top-down view, and it looked a little bit distorted and weird. So that was an interesting thing that we worked with the gallery at MOPA to adjust. And so then, after it was in gallery, we kept it simple. We left out any of that kind of size adjustment stuff, and we were surprised. We'll come back to that later in the visitor section. We were surprised at how keeping it simple and leaving any kind of cruft out of it let the visitors craft their own experience. And so we wanted to pitch a web version, because one thing that we couldn't do in the gallery was let people save a picture of their experience. So again, open source, we found another library, Alex Wiles, put together something which was a webcam made of emoji that made up the pixels in your face. And he made it with P5.js, which is a JavaScript version of processing. And it's on the web. And so we adapted that, changed the aspect ratio. And the 7 Billion Others exhibit is probably trademarked and a bunch of other things. But so if you go to the website that's listed on that slide, and if you just don't enter a password and just hit OK, you can play with it on your own computer. It might crash in Safari, but it seems to work pretty well in Chrome. And then if you click on the little camera button, you can save a picture of yourself. So check that up. We'll leave that up for the rest of MCN.
If you check out my profile on Twitter, it's made up from a self-reflection image like this.
Yeah. So now we're going to talk about the museum technologist, so you get to hear me speak for a little bit more. So let's see. The first thing is that how do you approach these projects? And one of the biggest things that I'd recommend is getting involved early enough that you can be involved in figuring out what the problem is that you need to solve instead of being handed a solution up front. We've had some institutions who've come to us and they've said, hey, we've just invested in this giant $1,000 piece of hardware, or we have this giant multi-$1,000 piece of hardware that we want to use, make something for it. Okay, well, what are your goals? I don't know, we just want to have this thing in the gallery and we want you to use it. Or we have iPads, or we have, and so you want to be involved at the level where you can actually be creative within the constraints of their budget before they get to that step where they're defining the technological choice. The next thing is that figure out what are the inputs and the outputs. What is the simplest thing that you can do with what you're working with? And know the strengths and weaknesses of the technology stacks. And we'll cover this a little bit more a little bit later. But be thinking about maintenance from the beginning. Start thinking of, okay, how am I going to maintain this? If I'm putting this in a case or something, you guys know this already from exhibit design. You want to make sure that everything's easily accessible. But you also want to think who's going to be responsible for maintenance, because you want to be the museum technologist. You want to have fun and be creative. You don't really want to be the tech support person. And so it's really important to have these conversations early in the process. And you're wearing so many hats in the museum technologist section. Sometimes you're both a designer and the developer and also the quality assurance because you don't really have a dev team, and you're also maybe the project manager because you don't have a project manager on some projects. And so make sure that you clearly define the roles and set the expectations with your client or with the rest of your museum on who is playing what roles. So there's no confusion down the line and no ill will or enmity. And explain the process of what you're doing. If you're a consultant coming into a museum, they might not be familiar with your process. If you're a museum working with a consultant, ask them specifically what their process is to make sure that you know what to expect at every stage of it. And finally, one thing that I would highly recommend that's worked well with us for several projects in the park is when you're being creative, you don't necessarily know what you're going to have the time to build, and you don't really know what's going to be the final artistic work that you're going to create. So you need to have a little bit of time. So, and that's really rough, especially when you're working in a constraint of a very tight budget. So we recommend capturing everything that the client wants, brainstorming a whole bunch of ideas, and saying, this is the core functionality that we're going to deliver. If we have time, here's all the other features we can add. Let's prioritize these together. And they will be surprisingly opinionated. It's great. They will say, and they'll surprise you in some ways. So, yes. So another thing is that as you're coding things, as I talked about with the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and making that adjust the size of things, code for tweakability. There's a blog post that I wrote that's linked at the bottom of this that you can't read on the projector, but I'll post it to Twitter afterward, where at the Instant Conference, which is here in Minneapolis, it's a great conference. It's about interactive installations. A lot of the people who present show behind-the-scenes views of their code as they're prototyping it, and one of the things that they like to use is what I'll call a debug view. They have a lot of sliders and things where they can change the parameters of their code while they're running it so they can tweak it to make it really good. And processing, which is a creative coding framework, there's several creative coding frameworks like Open Frameworks, Cinder, processing, and then we're not even getting into the hardware stacks. But processing lets you have a tweak mode. It's built into processing 3 now. It's from Gal Sasson. And you can adjust the values while the code is running, which is fantastic. It's wonderful, and you can tweak things as you go. And that other thing is a screenshot from the engineering blog of 53, the folks who make the iPad and iPhone app paper, where they were trying to figure out the dimensions and the behavior of the loop when they were figuring out how to zoom when you pinch to zoom. And they had that in kind of a debug mode so that they could tweak it as they were testing it instead of compiling it each time with new variables.
And this is a great tool, if I can expand on this just for a minute. As you're sitting with stakeholders and wanting their feedback and opinions, perhaps doing some testing as well, this is a great approach to be able to sit in front of them and seamlessly test different variations of the idea within certain constraints. Allows them to be part of the process and allows you to get some really interesting user testing. As Jason said, we ended up not allowing the visitor to be able to change that variable, but we were able to change the variable in testing and find a sweet spot where it worked really well.
And if you're worried that this is going to take a lot of extra coding time, it's honestly probably not, especially if you're thinking of it from the beginning. And so that's what we're encouraging. So the next obligatory funding slide. How are you going to get money for this? There are many different ways to talk about this. I'm not going to get into these in depth, but IMLS Sparks Innovation or Ignition grants, and also the AAM EMC Arts funded by MetLife, both have grants for doing prototypes. And we'll make all these slides available online later. But now we're talking about creativity, and all I've talked about is the actual technology and the building things and all that. Where do you get your ideas is the one thing that most creative people hate to hear. The fact is that you get your ideas from remixing other ideas and things that you've gotten. And there's an illustrator named Jessica Hish who has this great diagram. I'm going to see if it shows up well here. Anybody in the room seen this on imitation versus inspiration? Okay, Jessica Hish has a great body of work. I won't even get into it now. But she made a little cartoon saying that when you're in grad school, you haven't really been exposed to that much. And so your brain is Tagmeister, some stupid band posters, DeviantArt, and then Pentagram and a few other things. And so when you make something, you have very few influences on your work, and so it looks like a ripoff. Even though it's not a ripoff, it's just you don't have enough influences for it to seem really your own work. But then as you get more experience out in the field, you have a lot more inspirations to draw from. 1930s drawings, pentagram, texture from an old album, typeface from Huffler and Frere Jones, color from a found advertisement. And so it doesn't really show off its influences quite as boldly. And then when you're an art director and you've been doing this for a really long time, you have all of these interests and influences that are inspiring your work, and it makes it more creative because pretty much everything is a remix. So how do you stay current if you need to be reading all of these things and you have a day job and you have to put food on the table? As my father likes to say, I like food with my meals. So read the internet. And if you're saying, I don't really have time for this, you can schedule these things and put this into your schedule sometime when you're eating lunch at your desk. But read the internet, follow interesting people on Twitter. Tiny Letter, there's kind of a resurgence in email newsletters. Highly recommend Alexis Madrigal's. It used to be 5 Interesting Things, and now it's Real Future. And then there's another professor of engineering at Olin College named Deb Chatra, who has a newsletter called MetaFoundry, and it's all about material science and really cool stuff. So highly recommend both of those and plenty others. I'll geek out about that at length. Keep a personal sketchbook or an Evernote or a Pinterest. Keep track of the links that you have so that you have some way to track them and use them on future projects later so that you can go back and refer to them. Share links with other people. MuseTech has a Slack channel. If you look it up, I think it's musetech.slack.com. And feed your friends. Find out what your friends are interested in. Tell your friends what you're interested in. And then whenever they come across things, they'll ping you and say, hey, did you see this really amazing thing? And most of the time, you probably haven't seen it, and it'll really inform your work. Seek out interesting conferences that are outside the museum space. Chad and I were having a long conversation about this as we were putting things together, but Creative Mornings, Instant, XOXO, UX conferences, dance conferences, pretty much there are all sorts of different domains that can apply to what you're doing in unexpected ways, and keeping your brain fresh and inspired can help. And document what you do, finally. And I was going to say we're kind of bad at that because we haven't put a lot of our code on GitHub or anything yet, but hopefully this presentation is the start of that and in documenting things.
Right, and not the code maybe, but I think the information share and the feeding your friends, we are quite good at that. We have Slack channels that will, in the future, become amazing projects and are on their way to becoming amazing projects. And so, and Jason is legendary at this, as he finds a nugget that he knows Chad or Brinker or Nick might love to see, that'll get fired off in an email and it'll end up on Slack, and we'll be able to find it again in 3 months when we really need it, and it's the perfect idea.
So when do you find time for this? And that's what everybody is probably asking. That's what I'm asking. And it's easy to get burned out on the everyday grind. I recommend doing bite-sized pieces more regularly. This summer I had the luxury of going to museum camp and Museum of Art and History in Santa Cruz, and Nina Simon, Beck Tench was facilitating, and one of the things that they talked about was making time for ritual, basically carving out time. And we do that in Balboa Park pretty well. Nick Honeyset sets up time every 2 weeks on a Friday. He buys beer and pizza. Probably shouldn't have said the beer part. And it's BPI Friday, Beer Pizza Ideas. And we sit around and we do a staff meeting, but then we also talk about, here's the really cool stuff that we saw this week in tech that might influence our jobs. Another thing is, if you're having trouble finding time in your schedule, do lunch, do coffee, find things, do walking meetings, find a way to do things in the interim spaces, the liminal spaces in between your everyday schedule. And involve everybody in the office. As I said with the beer, pizza ideas, bring food, bring the donuts. And yeah, I think I've covered everything on here. So now we're going to get into, this is the Brinker part of it. So that person up there is Garrett, who's Brinker's now husband, then fiance. And this project started when they were engaged and she was going to school in Boston, and he was working out in San Francisco, and they wanted some way to kind of, aside from email and IM, that they could kind of share an experience, especially going to a museum long distance. So what they prototyped was this pillow over here, the heart pillow. And they worked from some open source code that we'll have in the links on here, built this quick prototype that listens to the heartbeat, and then they pushed it out through a low frequency speaker. So they could record somebody's heartbeat and then play it back. And the idea was to have something where you're transmitting this heartbeat between two pillows, and two people are hugging the pillows in museums all the way across the country and feeling the same experience in different galleries as they're looking at things. And so this was one of the first prototypes. This is in the San Francisco Fine Arts Museum and the De Young Fine Arts Museum. Yes, I think so. And so then here's the Academy of Sciences, and she prototyped it right in front of the big aquarium that they have there. You can see the kids getting really into it. And then at the Tech Museum in San Jose. And one question that I had is, so how is this working? Is this person feeling her heartbeat, and is she feeling his? And since this is just a prototype, it's just a prototype. You don't have to make everything work. And so what they're doing here is they're just recording a heartbeat and playing back a heartbeat for somebody else while recording theirs the next time. And then taking it out into public parks as well. This is in the East and South Bay at the Oakland Museum. So this is the Stanford Cantor Center. And so this was her first prototype. She made it, and is Coven in the audience? Okay, do we have a Coven? We're looking for a Coven. So she called up Coven Smith and said, and asked him for advice. And he said, what's the so what? You're recording this heartbeat. How does this apply to museums? How is this specific to museums? What makes this a museum project? What makes you need to be in a museum for it? And so the idea for prototype number 2, based on that conversation, is that she wants it to be a more communal experience. And so, Chad, you can probably talk to this more, but James Turrell is on the left exhibit.
Yeah, if you saw an Ignite talk by me, you may have seen my wife and I in a picture that was in the same space, glowing pink by this James Turrell. It's an amazing communal experience. It's one of my ultimate museum experiences, to come in off the street on a summer day and to lay flat on your back on a cold floor looking up at this amazing lightscape. You have a community immediately there, sharing an aesthetic experience.
So Brinker's second idea was to try to make this more of a communal, collective heartbeat visualization and feeling. And so getting a bunch of people to lie on the floor in a Turrell exhibit or in front of a piece of artwork and record their heartbeats and give them that feedback as well, but also visualize it on the skin of the museum with projection mapping, perhaps inspired by these works. The one on the right is sensory, and I can't remember what the one on the left is. It's Charles Pedion's heartbeat installation, which was 100,000 balloons beating in the heart of London in sync.
And even as you see these, you may catch this kind of meta-narrative, because you'll note the James Turrell reference, which is something that Brinker and I talked about, the conversation with Coven. So she's opening herself up to somebody else, a friend in the community, to talk about the project. Even the Instagram on the right was one that I took during a presentation at Instant and said, Brinker, you've got to take a look at this, because I knew what she was working on and what she was interested in.
So yes, that segues into visitors, and
that's right.
That's all you, Chad.
Visitors. So what exactly does it mean to be creative, the creative beating heart of your community, both as a interesting prototype project, but also as a museum, to serve as a community platform for creativity. Just as museum workers need outlets to push the field, members of the public need platforms where they can share their creative work, connect, and collaborate. So we're going to circle back this is the pinball effect. One of the effects of the self-reflection was what actually happened in the galleries. Once this was in the galleries, partly, I think, due to the decisions we made about simplicity, about there being no controls, about allowing instant, always-on access to this experience, people used it as a creative tool. At the beginning, we thought it would be really cool to have some sort of photo-taking capability within the interactive, that it would make it more interactive. We were wrong. The way it turned out, it was much more interactive when we allowed the experience to take place outside of the thing we made. People used it as part of their own creative works. We ended up with a Pinterest board full of several hundred photos of people taking photos of themselves and posting it on their own networks.
In the museum business, we talk about things being interactives, the things that we create, digital interactives, but the interaction doesn't necessarily have to happen in what you're building. You don't need to draw attention to what you're building with bells and whistles. The interaction can be in the experience that the people have in front of what you're building.
So even the simplicity, even the constraints of your project, you can use to focus attention on the audience. Good design is invisible.
99% invisible.
That's right. Mostly. It's not the amazingness of the interaction, it's the amazingness of the experience.
So this is a diagram from Samuel Hulick from useronboard.com, and he's talking about user experience in products and trying to convince companies that they are not selling a product, they are selling a better version of their consumer or their user. So this is Super Mario, picks up the fire flower, and then he's gigantic and can throw fireballs. He's got superpowers. Kathy Sierra also talks about the point is you are giving your users superpowers. So try to think of your visitors in the museum the same way. Try to see how you can make them better versions of themselves. And that's what you're offering them.
So when we talk about visitors being creative, I try to get organizations to point back to a mission statement, which often includes some words about inspiration, inspiring people. And for some institutions, this means building maker spaces in labs and incubators, being a TED venue, that sort of thing. That can be expensive. That can be a big budget item. And what often gets lost in that is that a maker space requires not just an initial capital outlay, but requires staff and maintenance and long-term care and hand-holding.
And expendables.
The low-hanging fruit, though, is to treat those galleries as creative spaces. People are bringing creative tools with them to the galleries every day. And it can be as simple as allowing them to use the tools they already have. So Instagram, Vine, Snapchat, 123D Catch. These are all creative tools that allow people to see in new ways. So here's what a creative visit experience means today. It means that museums have to walk the walk. It means museums have to open up their galleries to allow them to be creative spaces. I love this.
Has anybody seen this before? This is a kind of visitor guide for people who are visiting the National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Seoul, South Korea. And they used cat cartoons to illustrate it. So they're telling people they're allowed to take photos. Please keep their mobile phones on vibrate. There are links at the bottom of the slide of where we found this from. Somebody took a picture of this on Twitter, and then they tracked down the provenance of it. I want to highlight attention to two of them.
Kisses are okay.
Yeah.
All questions are welcome. Yes, and the next one, and I think I will tell this story.
Don't get in trouble.
I'll try not to get in trouble. So my old museum, this is the North Carolina Museum of Art, had I come from a curatorial background. I'm an art history guy. And so when my art museum, which I loved, had a show, an exhibition, a giant, beautiful, blockbuster exhibition about Porsche, I have to admit, a little bent out of shape because I thought it was sideways to the mission, etc. I was managing social media there at the time. But the one thing I was super excited about was that we allowed photography in the galleries for the first time for a major blockbuster. And not only did we allow it, but we put great signs up that said, please don't touch the cars, photography encouraged, please do this thing. And it turned out to be, for an art historian and an art guy, it made the space into an incredible creative space. The photos that people took in that space full of amazingly designed cars were tremendous art quality photos, which we collected and displayed in a couple different ways in the galleries. So even, this is kind of an example of those spaces, even when you perhaps don't imagine that they will be creative or you don't fill them with creativity, if you open them up, your visitors can make creative things out of them. When creativity happens, celebrate, share, promote, rinse, repeat. I don't know about the rinse part, but.
Definitely the repeat part. So this is an example of something from Mia last night. Alyssa Frankel, who's giving another session right now, took a picture of this painting as we were passing by it and said, somebody needs to meme this. And all of a sudden in her feed, her Twitter feed, there were tons of people putting deal with it sunglasses on the goat and putting iPhones and bling on the boy. And if you look very carefully at the image, you can see that there's like a Bible that's been photoshopped out of the image. But yeah, we thought this looked like, so this is our segue into the Q&A.
Actually, for that bit, I hadn't thought about this before. Can you go back to that image? The beautiful bit about that from a social media perspective, that even the act of sharing that, so Alyssa didn't add anything to that picture. She just took a snapshot and sent it on and said, look at this. Even that started this train of thought where other people did creative things to it, which I love.
And in the chain of her comments, it looks like we weren't the first people to do this. Some folks at MIA had done this before on Snapchat and had added all sorts of interesting things to it. So something for us to look up afterward online. Okay, we've talked way too much. Now's your turn. Questions, comments, rants. If you have rants, please limit them to about 1 minute for the sake of the other people in the audience.
But also suggestions, like how do you manage creativity in your own space, in your own job, in your own department? Meredith.
I was just, do you want me to shout or use the microphone?
Hello.
Yeah, thanks. Love your presentation. I was just reminded of a simple thing that we've been doing and repeating to get people to be creative at my museum. Empty SMK Instawalks. I'm sure lots of you have been doing that, but that's really, really popular with the Instagram community in Copenhagen, and people even come traveling for it because it's such a special treat to be allowed into an empty museum outside opening hours, and people take fantastic pictures and they share them and they become automatically ambassadors for other people to come visit the museum because they tell their community that we have great art and great spaces and that we are an institution that welcomes people's own interpretations.
I just had a question. You mentioned institutions should invest in the infrastructure, and I wondered if you could share a little bit more details about that. You said like plumbing. I didn't know if that was like symbolic of like what kind of networking cables you need or whatever, especially for like the digital immersive like projection mapping things. Like that requires a certain space, a certain setup before you start, mounting giant projectors on the ceiling. So what would you include in that kind of basic infrastructure that organizations should have if they're going to have a space or that's going to be able to allow this kind of creativity?
Well, real plumbing is important, certainly. We need to make visitors feel comfortable. Plumbing, in particular, we deal a lot with collection information, and to have that available via an API or some other easy data feed means that we don't have to deal with that for a certain interactive installation. It means we can spend our time on a more creative aspect of it. And so I think that's a little bit of what we were talking about when we talk about kind of baseline infrastructure and plumbing.
We could probably do a whole presentation on infrastructure alone. And I don't think it's one size fits all, so I can't really tell you. But if you're looking to get into projection mapping, you'd probably want to research what the things are in the field. And if you can't research, maybe bring in a guest artist or a guest speaker who can start to educate your staff and maybe give a talk to the. We know some great projection mapping folks, but also go to conferences where they talk about projection mapping. And I know we keep on tooting the horn of Instant, which is here in Minneapolis in the Walker Arts Center. But yes, Instant, it's awesome. And I/O, which is its big sibling, are both fantastic for finding people who are at the cutting edge of those fields and have a lot of war stories from the trenches. Another thing is to try to fight to get an R&D budget so that you can start to acquire little things. I mean, if you want to do projection mapping, you'd at least want to have a projector in the office. And there's a lot of open source software. There's even, I think, a projection mapping thing that's in browser where you can put a web page and it puts it in an iframe and then it distorts it 3D and lets you play around with that. So lots of options that are out there that are free to get started with. Did we answer your question?
Sort of.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, like, are there any other, like, what would you say, like, the top 5 basics that a museum should have if you want to do, like, this kind of stuff, like, in staff, or whether it's in, like, we don't have a coder on our little 4-person IT staff. There's no one that does coding. Like, what do you do without that? Like, is that something you really, you contract out, or you try to build that capacity inside, or?
I would say you think of the things that you would need every time. And if you're a museum that has a collection focus, then the collection is something that you're going to use every time. And you're never going to look back in 10 years and say, oh, I wish we hadn't done that metadata work on the collection. We really didn't need to do that. That's not, no one's ever going to say that.
I don't know if there's really a starter kit necessarily because everybody's different, but yes. Brian, did you have a?
I to that point, I guess find the thing that you're doing over and over and over again in a really boring way, and spend the time to never have to do that again. Right. I mean, somebody said something to me one time that it was just a real eye opener, and it's very obvious that if you're doing something over and over and over again as a human being with a computer, you should get the computer to do that for you, because computers are very good at doing things very over and over and over and over again. And I think that's been a tool for us to be able to allow for more creativity by spending a week on that thing that took you 30 minutes, but it took you 30 minutes every week. If you just spend a week so you never have to do that again, then you've got that time back in the future to focus on creative activities and work. Because you can quickly, as a museum technologist, drown underneath all of those little small things. So you've got to build some time in to try to to create those systems so that you can focus on creativity, which is where we need to all be working.
And I think the natural extension of that is for the community as well. Like it made no sense for us to rebuild Metmir when we could take that and say, okay, this is a starting point, and we can be creative off of this. And so, the same is true with Miriam's work on Musduino. To offer a baseline for museums on physical computing and microcontrollers is brilliant, because then each project pushes the ball further.
And just since I have the microphone, I'll say that if you search Museum Computer Network in GitHub, you'll find not only the project that you guys built off of, but a bunch of other museums who are putting their code up on GitHub. And I'd encourage other people, if you don't know about that, get in touch with me or do a pull request on GitHub and put those up there as well.
And if you don't want to know what a pull request is on GitHub, then yeah, talk to us afterward. But it is kind of a scary world out there when you're unfamiliar with programming terms. And part of it is trying to figure out what the names of the things that you need to search for are. So you have to do two searches almost, or two generations of searches. You have to search to figure out what the search terms are. And then you have to search on the search terms that you really needed to search for in the first place, which can be really frustrating. And to follow on with your original question about you don't have a coder on staff, I don't know what works best economically for your department, but it might be good to bring on a consultant for just even a consulting basis. Or you can try to learn on your own, but it depends on the scale of what you want to try to implement. If you're just trying to implement something simple that's on the scale of like a word macro or some kind of automated spreadsheet that can tally up things and help make your life easier and do a lot of that drudge work, then that's something that maybe you can do in brown bag lunches where it's like, hey, everybody in the office, let's learn this together. Let's watch some YouTube videos, because there's a ton of YouTube videos that will teach you everything you ever need to know about a computer. Sorry, didn't mean to pick on you. Oh, okay.
Sure.
Can I ask another?
Yeah.
I was thinking about the whole idea of museum technologists and creativity. Often, in my experience, the managers in the museum don't know the creativity that technologists have, and they don't really appreciate or support the kind of work that you guys can do. Do you have any tips for how to talk to your managers and convince them that you need that free time in your job description to do that stuff that will help the entire organization work smarter?
That is a great question, because I think you're exactly right. In certain museums, art museums, photography museums, that sort of thing, a curator will perhaps have an exhibition and say, "Oh, I'm looking for a piece that might further this theme, and I'm looking for an interactive piece, and I know what I basically want it to do, but I need to find an artist that I might commission for that." Where the technologist on staff may even have an art background, may have done similar work outside of the museum, but is not called on to add any sort of inside expertise, inspiration, that sort of thing. I would say in that case, one suggestion would be to show your work, to be promiscuous about, oh, I did this cool thing, come see it. And that can be at a staff retreat, that can be in the lunchroom, that can be anywhere where you are showing off creative work. I think that goes to the question of culture in museums, and we talk about museums being open to the outside world. It's so important for museums to be open as well internally. For a lot of museum technologists, creativity is sometimes the thing that you try to do after hours, after work. Wouldn't it be great if those creative projects, those creative juices, were things that could happen during work hours, and your ideas could influence your museum and the sector and the field and help us all?
I'm going to turn that around a little bit towards anybody who might be listening to this later or is in the audience who's a manager, and say, if you're a good leader, you're interested in your people and you care about their well-being, and so you're going to be asking questions about them, and just pay attention to the things that they're interested in and try to maybe help them find some way to leverage those interests in what they're doing on their day-to-day job, and they'll get more excited. We have an IT guy in our department who doesn't really like IT all the time, but really likes soldering, used to be a welder, and does Raspberry Pi projects in his spare time all the time. He's not a coder. He just borrows whatever he can find online and gets it working. But that's great. And we rolled him into some of our Raspberry Pi projects that we've been working on in the park, and he is loving it. So the more that you can get people involved in what they're passionate about and find out what their passions are, the better.
And I think I had written earlier a roadmap for Sidetracks. Have some idea of what might become of those side ideas.
Any other questions? Yes.
Did you guys find that in doing this, you were able to educate other staff members on how you did it? Like they would come up and ask questions like, whoa, this is really cool. I want to at least sort of start to grasp how you did it, and then they take that knowledge and move with it a little elsewhere. And so that sort of creates like what you're saying with like the institutional culture of openness.
I think so. I think particularly because the self-reflection anyway was done in processing, which is very accessible and has amazing videos online by Daniel Schiffman.
Yes, plug for Daniel Schiffman.
Plug
He's
for
like
Daniel Schiffman.
the patron saint of creative coding.
Yeah.
Yes.
And even now, you can speak to this, Jason. There's a movement in the office for.
Yeah, we've had a lot of people who are interested just from the things that they've seen, everyone from office managers to budgeteers to social media folks who are like, I'd really like to learn how to code. Where can I start? And if you're doing creative coding work in the museum space, then be prepared to answer that question. But yeah, I think most of us are very open and sharing about what we do, and just try to capitalize on that excitement while it's there. Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.